Over the years, as I've done thousands of figure drawings from life, I found this process very useful. Instead of jumping straight to the halftones and all the details, I map in that most important separation of light and shadow and make sure I get those edges right. Because then filling in that shadow shape is extremely easy. And bam, it looks 3D. So follow this process. In this lesson, I'm gonna show you how I go through what's called shadow mapping.
Ooh, shadow mapping!
And at the end, I'll give you a project so you can practice. So shadow mapping is the later part of the linear lane. I'll usually start a drawing by establishing the proportions and major shapes, but right around that part where I need to start establishing the 3D forms, it becomes very useful to indicate the edges of the shadows. There are 3 things you're gonna be looking for as you go around every side of every shadow shape in your drawing and establishing its edge type. The core shadows. Making that edge along the Terminator sharp, firm, or soft tells us a lot about the interior of that form, quickly turning our 2-dimensional silhouettes into something that feels 3D. Then there's cast shadows. These are much more rare along our form, but when they are there, they add the much needed sharp edges and they help establish relationships between forms that are touching or close together, and the actual silhouette around an object. Usually this will be a sharp edge, but sometimes if I have a dark background behind the shadow side and I don't want to create a focus on that area, I turn it into a lost edge. Finding the Terminator.
I'm back.
Okay, yeah, all right. You already know that the Terminator is really important because it marks that exact border between the light and shadow side within the form. And I've mentioned how important it is to separate those two families when shading. You need to get good at identifying this border instantly, at a glance, when you look at your reference. When you first start shading, you might look at this photo and see a whole bunch of halftones and shadows and reflected lights and highlights and be confused about where exactly the light side becomes the shadow side. Sometimes it's obvious, but other times, not so much. Being able to find that Terminator is the answer. So let's work on it. By the way, this lesson is part of my Drawing Basics course. So if you need a review on shape design, proportions, construction, perspective, shading, head over to proko.com/drawing for all the other lessons, demos, and critiques. There's a lot of stuff over there.
You can get 20% off all courses and tools right now at proko.com until December 4th.
Let's start simple. From observation, it's kind of straightforward. The Terminator goes up the wall, around the cap, and then back down the other side, creating this curved plane of the entire part of the cylinder that faces away from the light. The top cap is lit up because the light source is above the cylinder. Now, if I drop the light below this cap, the Terminator jumps to include the top cap in the shadow family. If I'm drawing the cylinder, or really any form, from imagination, and I want the light to be above and to the right, I need to imagine at which part of this curved plane does the light no longer hit. From top view, if the light is here, the Terminator will be here and here at an angle perpendicular to the light. If the viewer looks at the cylinder from over here, they'll see this much shadow and this much light. So if I transfer that ratio to the cylinder, I can draw that vertical core shadow at that Terminator position. This amount of shadow and this amount of light, as we just imagined in a top view. I know this could seem very mathematical and we're past the perspective part of the course, but we can never truly get away from perspective. And I would never actually draw the top view to figure this out. I'm just showing you this so you can understand the logic that could help you visualize it in your head while you draw. In the end, it comes down to a gut feeling of where that core shadow will be, based on the position of the light in relation to the form. As we bring the light closer to the angle of the viewer, the light side gets bigger. As we bring the light farther away or behind the form, the shadow side will get bigger. Complex organic forms. This all applies to complex forms. If you're drawing an arm, well, it's kind of a cylinder. It's cylindrical with some hills and valleys. But here's the catch. Unlike a cylinder, it's not gonna be that same ratio all the way down. On organic forms, that ratio changes along the form. We're imagining that perpendicular plane as it moves along the form. Remember, the Terminator is where the form starts to turn away from the light. Think of this complex organic form like a cake that you can slice through at any level. Point the light at each slice from the same angle, and you'll see the light pattern is different for each slice. It's the plane direction that determines whether you're in shadow or light. Finding the Terminator from imagination might be difficult at first. It requires an ability to imagine the 3D object in relation to the light source in the environment. So actually, all that stuff we learned in the perspective section and all the projects and exercises we did are more important than you may have realized. The good news is the position of the Terminator, it doesn't have to be precise. It just has to be kinda generally in the right place and feel right. So maybe perspective isn't that important? Well, it is, and it isn't. You should get it close, but you don't have to get it perfect. It's more important for the shape of the shadow to have a good design and communicate the form to the viewer. I didn't follow the exact shapes of the shadows I saw, and it still looks right. I'm not making any major changes. I'm still keeping the shadow on the right side, but notice how I made it thicker here and more active here. I made this shape be just a tad more descriptive of the muscles of the forearm. I understand the anatomy, and I can change it without breaking the anatomy. Ooh, the common mistakes. First of all, flat light or soft light. Even if there is a light direction and there's a shadow side and a light side, sometimes the light is so soft that it's really difficult to see exactly where the light ends and the shadow starts. And that's where just being able to imagine the light source in relation to the form helps a lot. So even if you don't see an obvious Terminator, you can at least invent one that makes sense. Next, dark halftones can be confused as shadows. So just be careful with those. Also, reflected lights could be misinterpreted as direct light. But yeah, no, they're not. They're still shadows. Finally, sometimes cast shadows are not completely obvious. For example, this shadow on the biceps actually has a cast shadow along this entire side. So shading this with a core shadow around the whole shape would look very strange. Level 1. I provided you guys with several photos of arms. Your job is to do exactly what you saw me do here. Start with your linear lay-in and then map in the core shadows, cast shadows, and contours, focusing on getting the proper edge type. Your forms should feel three-dimensional without taking it to a shaded finish. Level 2, you're gonna do the same thing, except the photos I provided you are flat lit. They don't have an obvious separation of light and dark. So your job is to invent a light source and imagine the edge of that shadow. Make sure you use the right edge. Softer on large round forms, firmer on those thin tendons and bones, and sharp on cast shadows. Yes, invent cast shadows where you think they would appear. Feel free to head over to this lesson on Proko.com and post your assignment there. Join our cool little community. All right, good luck.